village of St. Mary Mead had always been a place of calm, where the rhythm of life was predictable and steady, like the ticking of an old clock. In the mornings, the scent of freshly baked bread would waft from Mrs. Treadwell's bakery, and, in the evenings, the sound of the church bell would ring out, marking the passage of time. The villagers went about their lives with a sense of comfort, and any disruption to their peaceful existence was re-ranned, typically short-lived. But that peaceful rhythm was about to be interrupted, and it would be a change none of them could have anticipated. Chapter 01. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon that the news first broke. Miss Marple had been enjoying her customary tea at her cottage, the steam from her teapot curling lazily upward, when a rapid knock on the door disturbed the stillness. She rose slowly from her chair, smoothing her cardigan, and opened the door to find Constable Hawkins standing there, his usual demeanor replaced by one of grim seriousness. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with the shock of something unsettling. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "I'm afraid there's been a terrible incident. You'll want to know about this." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. Hawkins was not one to overstate things, and the urgency in his voice was enough to make her take notice. "Come in, Hawkins," she said, stepping aside to allow him into the small but tidy sitting room. "What's happened?" Hawkins stepped into the room, looking slightly uncomfortable in the warmth of her cottage. He removed his cap, running a hand through his hair before speaking. "There's been a murder," he said simply. "Down at the Darby estate, a man named Gregory Abbott was found dead in the study." Miss Marple froze. The Darby family was not one she had expected to hear involved in any scandal, at least not in this way. Mrs. Darby was the picture of composure, a matriarch who carried herself with the dignity of someone who had always been in control. To think that someone had been murdered on her property felt wrong, somehow. She had never heard of Abbott, and yet the name seemed familiar, as though it had been woven into the quiet background of the village's life. "Gregory Abbott," Miss Marple repeated. "Who was he, and how did this happen?" Hawkins hesitated before answering, clearly not eager to divulge too many details. But Miss Marple could see that he was struggling with the weight of the news. "He was a businessman from London," Hawkins explained, pacing slightly, "who had some dealings with the Darby family, or so it seems. We're still piecing things together, but it looks like he was working with them on some land deals. He wasn't someone who had been around St. Mary Mead long. We think he arrived only a few days ago, and now he's dead. We're not sure if it was an accident, a break-in, or something more." Miss Marple felt a subtle shift in the air. Something about the way Hawkins spoke made it clear that he was not fully convinced that the death was an accident, but rather something deliberate, something that had been planned. "What do the Darbys say about it, Kay?" she asked gently, her voice as calm and steady as ever. "They say they don't know anything," Hawkins replied, his voice tinged with skepticism. "They claim they've never met him before, but there's something about all of this that doesn't sit right with me, Miss Marple. This isn't an ordinary murder. We're missing something, and I thought you might have some insight into this." Miss Marple paused, her mind already turning over the few details Hawkins had shared. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and there was something in his tone that told her this was no random death. There was more to this story than met the eye. "The Darbys have lived in this village for years," Miss Marple mused aloud. "They have ties to many of the prominent families here. They've always kept to themselves, but their name carries a great deal of influence. If this Abbott man had business with them, it could mean more than just a simple transaction." Hawkins nodded, looking relieved that Miss Marple was taking the matter as seriously as he was. "That's what I think too, Miss Marple. But I'm not sure how to move forward. I have spoken to Mrs. Darby, but she's as calm as ever. Too calm, in fact. Something about the way she said she didn't know him struck me as ... Wrong, Miss. Marple's sharp eyes flickered over to Hawkins. I'll help you with this, Hawkins, but I need to take a look at the scene myself. If the Darbys are involved in any way, we need to be certain of what we're dealing with. Of course, Miss Marple, Hawkins replied, clearly grateful for her guidance. I'll take you to the estate. We need to get to the bottom of this. Darby Estate was just as imposing as Miss Marple had imagined it to be. The long gravel drive leading up to the house was lined with tall, neatly trimmed hedges. And the house itself was grand, perhaps too grand for a village like St. Mary Mead. The windows were all tightly shut, the curtains drawn, as though trying to hide the secrets inside. Miss Marple could sense that the house, like the family, was filled with something hidden beneath its polished surface. Hawkins led the way up the front steps, his hand resting on the brass knocker. But before he could knock, the door swung open to reveal Mr. Hargrove, the Darby family's ever-present butler. His face, as always, was composed, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed the tension of the situation. Miss Marple, Constable, he said, his voice as polite as ever, though the faint quiver in his tone suggested that even he wasn't immune to the shock of the day's events. Mrs. Darby is expecting you. As they entered the large foyer, Miss Marple noticed the oppressive silence that filled the space. There were no sounds of life, no servants bustling about, no chatter between family members. The house felt empty, as though it had been drained of its usual vitality. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. They followed Mr. Hargrove down the hall, and when they reached the study, the door was already open, revealing the scene of the crime. Gregory Abbott lay slumped across the desk, his face pale and lifeless, the flicker of a candle casting long shadows across the room. The disarray around him suggested a struggle, but it wasn't clear yet what had happened. Miss Marple stepped into the room, her eyes taking in every detail. Her gaze flickered over the scattered papers on the desk, the overturned chair, and the glass of wine that had spilled across the floor. Nothing seemed entirely in place, yet nothing stood out as too extraordinary. She moved closer to the body. She bent down, her eyes scanning the surface of the desk. Anything unusual? Hawkins asked quietly from behind her. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glimmer of something, a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the corner of the desk. She reached for it and unfolded it carefully, her fingers steady despite the weight of the moment. The note was short, hastily written in a hand she did not recognize. Meet me at midnight. There's more to the land deal than you know. Don't trust them. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The note was dated the evening before, just hours before Abbott had been found dead. It was no random act of violence. Someone had been trying to silence Gregory Abbott before he could reveal what he had learned. Turning to Hawkins, Miss Marple said quietly, "We've only just begun to uncover the truth, but this note confirms what I've suspected. Someone is trying to protect something or someone, and they'll stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden." Hawkins stared at the note in her hand, his expression grim. "So, we're back to square one. Yeah, Mrs. Darby's story doesn't add up." Miss Marple nodded. "No, it doesn't. But we're closer now. Need to find out who Abbott was meeting that night and why he was so certain there was more to the land deal. The answers are here, somewhere in this house." As Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Darby's study, the storm outside raged on, and with each passing moment, the darkness surrounding the Darby family's secrets seemed to grow heavier. The truth was close, but so was danger. Tools. The rain had settled into a persistent drizzle by the time Miss Marple left the Darby estate. The weight of the scene in the study clung to her, each detail pressing against her thoughts. She had seen much in her time, crimes of passion, of desperation, of greed, but there was something about this one that felt different. This wasn't just a simple murder, a crime of opportunity. It was deliberate, calculated, and it had been covered up with the same precision that it built. The Darby family's legacy. Someone had killed Gregory Abbott to protect a secret that was still shrouded in shadows. As Miss Marple walked back down the long gravel drive, her thoughts moved quickly. She had already made her mental list of things to pursue. The mysterious note found in the study, the possibility that Gregory Abbott had been involved in more than just land deals, excluding peculiar behavior of Mrs. Darby. But most pressing of all, she knew she had to revisit the village archives. There was more history buried in the dusty pages than the Darby family wanted anyone to know. And there, Miss Marple suspected, laid the key to everything. The village square was quiet when she returned. The usually bustling streets were empty, the shops closed for the evening. Only the faint murmur of voices from the pub broke the silence. Miss Marple made her way to the small archives building at the far end of the square, a place she had visited countless times in her search for the past. The large wooden door creaked as she entered, and the familiar smell of old paper and dust filled the air. She had spent many afternoons here, reading through parish records, family histories, and land deeds, all of which had once been the foundation of her investigation. But today, the archives felt different. There was something personal about the secrets she was about to uncover, something more sinister than anything she had encountered before. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across the rows of dusty shelves. Miss Marple's eyes flicked over the spines of the old records, her fingers brushing lightly over the ledgers as she searched for the one she needed. The ledger containing the Darby family's estate history had always been easy to find. It had been the subject of numerous inquiries over the years, most of them harmless, but not all. As she pulled the volume from the shelf, her eyes caught on a different record, tucked behind it a small, unmarked ledger that seemed out of place. It was much older than the Darby estate records, its binding frayed and its pages yellowed. Curious, Miss Marple pulled it free and opened it. The handwriting was shaky, but the content was clear enough. It was a ledger of transactions, but the names listed were not those of any common landowners. Instead, they were people who had long been whispered about in the village, figures who had been buried in the darkest corners of St. Mary Mead's history. There were names that Miss Marple recognized from her own childhood, from tales that had been passed down from the older villagers. People like Gregory Abbott, but also others who were less well known. The ledgers seemed to suggest that these people had been involved in much more than just land dealings. They were connected to darker transactions, something far more dangerous. As Miss Marple read through the pages, her heart began to pound with the realization of what she was uncovering. These names weren't just part of business deals. They were part of a network, a network that had ties to the Darby family, but also to other families in the village. It was as though Miss Marple had stumbled upon a hidden society, one built on the exchange of power, money, and favors. The Darbys had been at the center of it all, but they weren't the only players. The village itself had been complicit in keeping these secrets buried. Miss Marple closed the ledger with a sigh, her mind worried with the connections she had just discovered. This was it. This was what Samuel Preston had been getting too close to. He had uncovered the dark underbelly of St. Mary Medan underbelly that no one wanted to face, and that some were willing to kill to keep hidden. She knew now that the Darby family's reputation was built on more than just land. It was built on a foundation of corruption that reached far deeper than anyone had imagined. As she stood there in the dimly lit room, Miss Marple felt a shiver run down her spine. She was not afraid. She had seen enough in her time to know that the truth was often more dangerous than any threat. But she did feel a sense of urgency now. The murder of Gregory Abbott, the mysterious note in the Darby estate, and the hidden ledger all pointed to one thing. The Darbys had something to lose, and they were willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. But who had killed Abbott? Who had silenced him before he could reveal the truth? And why had he been targeted in such a public manner, with all the attention that would surely follow? Miss Marple knew that someone had to answer for this death, and she was determined to find the truth. But as she stood in the archives, she also knew that the killer would not be easy to catch. There were too many layers to this mystery, too many people with their own agendas, each of them hiding something, leaving the archives. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her cottage, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The information she had uncovered was critical, but she needed more. She needed to understand the full extent of the Darby family's influence and the people who had been involved with them over the years. And, more than anything, she needed to find out who had the most to lose from Preston's investigation. As she walked along the winding path, she was suddenly aware of a figure approaching from the opposite direction. It was Mrs. Treadwell, walking with a purposeful stride, her eyes fixed ahead. Miss Marple felt a pang of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Treadwell had been so quiet during the investigation, so distant, and yet she seemed to be involved in some way tied to the Darbys, to the land deals, to the web of corruption that had been uncovered. Miss Marple knew that she needed to speak to her again to see if the woman's involvement could shed more light on what had truly happened. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Treadwell," Miss Marple called as she approached. Mrs. Treadwell stopped, her face frozen for a moment in what seemed to be a mix of fear and recognition. "Miss Marple," she replied, her voice tight. "I didn't expect to see you out here. I've been in the archives." "Mrs. Treadwell," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes locking with the other woman's, "and I've uncovered some things. I think it's time we had another conversation." Mrs. Treadwell hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I suppose so, Kay. I don't know how much more there is to say, Miss Marple, but you're right. We need to talk." Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. There was more to Mrs. Treadwell's story than she was letting on, and Miss Marple could feel the tension in her voice. "There's always more, Mrs. Treadwell, always." And with that, Miss Marple knew that the next steps in the investigation would bring everything to a head. The truth was closer than ever, but it was still shrouded in secrecy. It would take everything Miss Marple had to untangle the web of lies and bring the killer to justice. The time for subtlety had passed. Chapter 02. The conversation with Mrs. Treadwell had been brief, but Miss Marple could tell from the woman's guarded response that there was more to uncover. Mrs. Treadwell had been reluctant to reveal anything of value, but Miss Marple's instinct told her that the quiet and ease in the woman's eyes held the key to the final pieces of the puzzle. Miss Marple's mind raced with the possibilities, her thoughts churning as she made her way back to her cottage. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its cobblestone streets and quaint cottages, felt like an almost idyllic place, and yet, beneath its calm surface, Miss Marple could sense the undercurrents of deception and betrayal. The Darby family's secrets, Gregory Abbott's death, and now Mrs. Treadwell's suspicious behavior all pointed to one thing. The past had come alive, and it was demanding to be addressed. The mystery had a shape now. There were no more vague suspicions, no more fleeting hints. Miss Marple was certain that Samuel Preston's death had been part of a much larger story. But the question was, who had killed him and why? Was it just about the land deal, or was something more insidious at play? Something that no one in the village was willing to acknowledge. As Miss Marple sat by her hearth, sipping a cup of tea, she replayed the day's events in her mind. The land deal, the Darby family's links to shady business dealings, Gregory Abbott's involvement with people whose names had been kept carefully out of the public eye. It's all pointed to something bigger. But what? The king? Who would benefit from Preston's death? The answer was still elusive, just out of reach. That night, Miss Marple spent several more hours in her study, reviewing her notes and turning the pieces of the puzzle over in her mind. She had learned much about the Darbys, but she was missing something crucial. She had spent so much time focusing on the land deals and Gregory Abbott's connections that she had failed to consider something simpler, something that could tie all the threads together. The Darby family had always been tightly knit, okay? They had kept to themselves, never fully engaging with the villagers beyond what was necessary. But what if their isolation was more than just a reflection of their social standing? What if it was a deliberate strategy meant to shield them from scrutiny? What if the land deals were just a smokescreen for something far more sinister? Miss Marple set down her tea and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. The answer seemed so clear now. She needed to go back to the basics. She had spent so much time analyzing the Darby family and their business dealings, but what about their personal lives? What about their relationships with one another? What about their own history? The following morning, Miss Marple visited the village church. It was a place that had stood at the heart of St. Mary Mead for centuries, and she knew that if she wanted to understand the Darby family, she had to understand their roots. The church records were well kept, and Miss Marple knew they might hold something of interest, perhaps a clue she had missed before as she entered the church. The scent of old wood and stone filled the air. The long pews were empty, the sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows, casting a soft, colorful glow on the floor. Miss Marple made her way toward the vestry, where the church records were stored, and began her search. She leafed through the pages, the delicate parchment crackling as she turned each one. It was a slow process, but Miss Marple was patient. She had learned long ago that patience was often the key to unraveling the deepest mysteries. After some time, Miss Marple found what she was looking for, a birth record dated more than 50 years ago for a child named Edith Darby. The name caught her attention immediately. She knew the Darby family had had children, but she had never heard of Edith. The records were sparse, but the name stood out to her like a signpost. It was a name she needed to investigate further. With the record in hand, Miss Marple left the church and walked down the familiar path toward the Darby estate. Her thoughts raced as she considered the significance of Edith Darby. Why had she never heard of her before? Why had the family kept her existence hidden? Miss Marple knew there had to be a reason, and she was determined to uncover it. At the Darby estate, Miss Marple was once again greeted by Mr. Hargrove, the ever-present butler. His expression was polite, but there was a flicker of wariness in his eyes as he ushered her inside. Miss Marple had no intention of letting him deter her. She had already spoken with Mrs. Darby, and now she needed answers from the source. "Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple said, as she stepped into the grand hallway. "I'm afraid I must ask about a member of your family, a woman named Edith Darby. I believe she was born many years ago, but I cannot find any record of her." Mr. Hargrove's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Miss Darby was not part of the family for long," he said, his voice clipped. "She was a distant relative, and her presence here was brief. I'm afraid I have no information to offer." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing. She had expected this response, but it didn't deter her. "I see," she said calmly. "But you do understand why I must ask, Mr. Hargrove. This family has been involved in so many dealings, and the more I learn, the more I realize that there are pieces of the puzzle missing. Edith Darby is one of those pieces." Mr. Hargrove's gaze flickered toward the door, as though considering whether he should call for help. But Miss Marple's tone remained steady, unwavering. She was no stranger to this kind of resistance, and she had learned how to press when necessary. "Tell me," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but firm, "why was Edith Darby never mentioned? And why, after all these years, does she seem to have been erased from the family history?" Mr. Hargrove's face darkened, and for a moment, Miss Marple could see the weight of old secrets pressing down on him. "Miss Darby's situation was complicated," he said at last, his voice low. "She was involved with someone. who didn't approve of her association with the family. And when things didn't work out, she was quietly removed from the picture. Removed, Miss Marple echoed, her brow furrowing. What do you mean by removed, Mr. Hargrove? The butler hesitated for a long moment, as though weighing his options. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Miss Darby's death was ... tragic. She drowned in a lake on the property. It was ruled an accident, but the family was never the same after that. They didn't want her memory to tarnish their reputation, so they chose to bury the past. Miss Marple's heart sank. The pieces were falling into place, but this revelation brought more questions than answers. Edith Darby had been a shadow in the family's history, and now it seemed that her tragic end had been the key to so much of what was happening in the present. Miss Marple stood up, her mind already racing with the implications of what she had just learned. Thank you, Mr. Hargrove, she said quietly. I believe I have enough to go on for now, but one thing is clear. There are still more secrets in this house than anyone realizes. As Miss Marple walked out of the Darby estate, the chill of the evening air wrapped around her, but she could feel the fire of determination burning within her. The past was never truly buried. It had a way of resurfacing when least expected, and Miss Marple was prepared to see it through to the end. The truth was within reach, and she would uncover it no matter what it took. Chapter 03. The air was crisp and sharp as Miss Marple made her way down the long gravel drive leading to the Darby estate. It had been a few days since her last visit, and the events of the past week weighed heavily on her thoughts. She had learned a great deal from Mr. Hargrove, but there were still pieces of the puzzle missing, bits of history that had been carefully hidden away. The sudden mention of Edith Darby, a name that had been practically erased from the family history, had intrigued her. The more she thought about it, the more she suspected that the key to this entire mystery lay in the dark corners of the Darby family's past. The Darby estate, with its looming architecture and ivy-clad walls, stood as an imposing monument to the family's wealth and influence. It was clear that Mrs. Darby was determined to maintain her control over the estate. But there was an undercurrent of unease within the family, one that Miss Marple had sensed the moment she had stepped into the grand drawing room. The deeper she dug into the family's history, the more the shadows seemed to grow, and the more she realized that things were not as they seemed. As Miss Marple approached the front door, she was once again greeted by Mr. Hargrove, whose expression remained as impassive as ever. He led her inside, but this time Miss Marple noticed a subtle difference in the air. The tension in the house was palpable, and she could feel it the moment she crossed the threshold. Mrs. Darby, though always composed, seemed on edge. Her polite smile was thinner than usual, her eyes betraying a flicker of discomfort as Miss Marple was shown to the drawing room. Miss Marple, how good of you to come back, Mrs. Darby said, her voice smooth but lacking the warmth it had held before. I trust you're making progress in your investigation. Miss Marple offered a small smile, though her eyes were sharp as ever. I'm afraid progress always requires more digging, Mrs. Darby. There are still many questions I have, and I'm certain that your family can shed light on them. Mrs. Darby's gaze flickered briefly toward the window, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of her chair. I believe I've told you everything I know, Miss Marple, she said, her tone suddenly more guarded. I trust the constable has been handling the matter properly. Miss Marple knew Mrs. Darby's words were carefully chosen. The Darbys were always cautious when it came to maintaining their image, and it seemed clear that this latest murder was threatening that carefully curated image. Miss Marple could sense that there was something Mrs. Darby was holding back, but she had to approach it delicately. If she pushed too hard, Mrs. Darby might close herself off completely. Of course, Constable Hawkins has been diligent, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, but with an underlying sharpness. There are some things that cannot be explained by simple facts alone. The connections between the Darbys and Gregory Abbott, the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. These things require more than just observation. They require understanding of what lies beneath the surface. Mrs. Darby stiffened slightly at Miss Marple's words, but her face remained impassive. I'm afraid I don't understand what. You mean, Miss Marple? What lies beneath the surface? Miss Marple smiled softly, leaning back in her chair. What I mean, Mrs. Darby, is that I've been doing some digging of my own. I have come across a name Medith Darby. She seems to have been a part of your family, but records suggest she vanished from history entirely. And I wonder why that is. For a moment, Mrs. Darby's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as though she had been caught off guard. She set her teacup down slowly, the porcelain clinking gently against the saucer. Edith Darby, Mrs. Darby repeated, her voice betraying a slight tremor. I believe that's a name you shouldn't concern yourself with, Miss Marple. That part of the family history is irrelevant. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying Mrs. Darby with a measured gaze. Irrelevant, you say? But you see, Mrs. Darby, I disagree. I believe Edith Darby's story is the key to understanding what happened to Gregory Abbott, to understanding why he had to die. The silence that followed was heavy, the room thick with unspoken words. Mrs. Darby's fingers clenched around the armrest. For the first time, she seemed to lose some of her composure. Miss Marple, ever observant, did not miss the subtle shift in Mrs. Darby's demeanor. I told you, Mrs. Darby said, her voice quiet now but tinged with something darker, that Edith was a distant relative. She was never a part of the family. Not really. There's nothing more to say. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Darby's face. But you see, Mrs. Darby, I believe there is more to this story. I've spoken to Mr. Pritchard, and I've found records that suggest Edith's death was not just an unfortunate accident. There's something hidden in the past, something that's been buried for a long time. The room seemed to close in on them as Miss Marple's words sank in. Mrs. Darby's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with a brief, sharp intensity. It was clear to Miss Marple that she was getting closer to the truth, but Mrs. Darby was not ready to reveal it yet. You are mistaken, Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said, her voice icy now. Edith's death was a tragic accident. There was nothing more to it than that. I suggest you leave it alone. Miss Marple stood slowly, her gaze unwavering. I can't leave it alone, Mrs. Darby. Not when there are lives at stake. Not when a man like Gregory Abbott has been killed. Someone is trying to keep something hidden, something that involves your family. And I won't rest until I uncover the truth. Mrs. Darby's face paled, but she regained her composure quickly. She stood up as well, her movements stiff. You've said enough, Miss Marple. I'll not tolerate these baseless accusations. Miss Marple didn't flinch. I'm not accusing anyone, Mrs. Darby. I'm simply seeking the truth, and the truth will come out, whether you like it or not. Without another word, Miss Marple turned and walked toward the door. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she could hear Mrs. Darby's voice calling after her, but she did not stop. She had learned everything she needed to know. The Darby family had more to hide than anyone realized, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth every last secret as she walked back toward her cottage. Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressed down on her shoulders. The past was never truly buried, always found a way to rise to the surface. And the Darby family's past was about to be exposed for all to see. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still much to uncover. Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation was coming, and when it did, the truth would shake the foundations of the entire village. But she would be ready. She always was. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself seated at the small writing desk in her cottage, a steaming cup of tea beside her, and a pile of notes in front of her. The pieces were slowly coming together, but there was still one part of the puzzle that eluded her. Mrs. Darby's evasiveness had only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. But there were questions that remained unanswered, and Miss Marple knew she couldn't rest until those answers were found. The mention of Edith Darby had been the turning point. Miss Marple had never heard of the woman before, and the fact that the Darby family had tried so hard to erase her from history only made her more curious. What had happened to Edith, and why was her death hidden behind the walls of secrecy? Could it be that her death had been a tragedy, or was it something darker, something that had laid the groundwork for the events that followed? With a mind full of questions, Miss Marple set about making plans for the day. She needed to speak with Mrs. Treadwell again. She had sensed something more in their last conversation. Mrs. Treadwell had been nervous, her lips tight as though she was holding something back. Miss Marple believed that the Treadwell family was connected to the Darbys, but in what way? And what role did they play in the tangled web of corruption that stretched through the village? Before she could make her way to the Treadwell cottage, Miss Marple decided to take a detour to the churchyard. It was a place that always gave her peace, a place where the history of the village had been quietly recorded for generations. The gravestones, worn by time, told stories of lives long past, of families that had shaped the village into what it was today. And it was in the churchyard that Miss Marple hoped to uncover something that might shed light on Edith Darby's mysterious death. The churchyard was quiet when Miss Marple arrived. The sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The mist that hung low in the air only added to the sense of melancholy that seemed to linger in the space. She made her way to the back of the church, where the oldest graves were situated. As she carefully examined the stones, she searched for any reference to Edith Darby. Her name had been elusive in the records, but Miss Marple had a hunch that something might appear here, perhaps a headstone, perhaps a family inscription that would provide the missing link. She walked past several graves before her eyes landed on one near the edge of the churchyard. The stone was old, worn, and nearly illegible, but as she leaned closer, she could make out a name, Edith Darby. The dates were faint, but there was no mistaking it. The grave was real, and it was here, tucked away in the corner of the churchyard, where it had been hidden for all these years. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her hand gently tracing the inscription on the gravestone. Edith Darby had died at a young age, far too young for such an early end. Miss Marple wondered what had truly happened to her. Was it an accident, as everyone had claimed, or was there more to the story? The mystery of Edith Darby's death seemed to be at the center of everything, the catalyst for the secrets that had been buried in the village for so long. As Miss Marple stood there, contemplating the gravestone, a shadow crossed the path ahead of her. She turned to see Mrs. Treadwell walking toward her, her face pale and drawn. The woman had not been expecting to see Miss Marple here, and the sudden appearance seemed to startle her. But there was something else in her eyes, something that spoke of regret, of guilt, and perhaps even fear. Miss Marple, Mrs. Treadwell said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't expect you to be here. Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the tension in the woman's posture. She had caught her off guard, just as she had expected. Mrs. Treadwell had been avoiding her. This was likely the first time they had been alone since their last conversation. I was just looking at the grave of Edith Darby, Miss Marple said calmly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Treadwell's face. I believe you know her name. She's been part of the Darby family history, though it seems her story has been kept quiet. Mrs. Treadwell's face paled even further, and she hesitated before speaking. Edith? Yes, I know of her, but that was a long time ago. There's nothing more to say. But there is, Mrs. Treadwell. Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but insistent. Edith Darby's death wasn't just an accident, was it? There's more to the story. I can sense it. For a long moment, Mrs. Treadwell said nothing. Her hands twisted nervously in front of her, and Miss Marple could see that the woman was struggling with something she was reluctant to share. Finally, Mrs. Treadwell spoke, her voice trembling. It wasn't an accident, she confessed. Softly it was. It was a drowning, yes, but it wasn't an accident. Edith had found something that my husband and the Darbys wanted to keep hidden, and when she found it, they had no choice. They had to silence her. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. What did Edith find? Mrs. Treadwell, Scree asked, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. Mrs. Treadwell's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, shaking her head. I don't know exactly, but I know she was involved in something. My husband, he was involved with the Darbys, you see. He helped them with their dealings, things that no one in the village ever knew about. But Edith found out, and when she did, she was determined to expose it all. She was going to go to the police. Miss Marple felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She could feel that the truth was within reach, but it was still fragmented, incomplete. Edith had been killed to protect the Darby family secrets. But what had she discovered that was so dangerous? What had been worth killing for? I believe you, Mrs. Treadwell, Miss Marple said, her voice softening. But I need more information. The truth cannot remain buried forever. I'm sure that what Edith found is the key to understanding why Gregory Abbott was killed and why Samuel Preston had to die. Mrs. Treadwell nodded, a sob catching in her throat. I wish I could tell you everything, Miss Marple, but I fear that if I do, it will ruin us all. You don't understand. There are people involved in this who will do anything to protect their secrets. Miss Marple stood, her mind already piecing together the implications of what Mrs. Treadwell had said. The connections were beginning to take shape, but there was still much left to uncover. Samuel Preston had died because he had gotten too close to the truth, just like Edith Darby had, and now it was up to Miss Marple to find out what that truth was before it claimed anyone else. I understand more than you think, Mrs. Treadwell, Miss Marple said, her voice firm with resolve, and I will find the answers. I always do. She turned to leave the churchyard. Miss Marple could feel the storm that had been brewing for years, finally ready to break. She was closer than ever to the truth, but with it came danger from those who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. The final pieces of the puzzle were within reach, and soon Miss Marple would uncover the deadly secret that had haunted St. Mary Mead for so long. The past had come calling, and Miss Marple was ready to answer. Chapter 4. The fog that had settled over St. Mary Mead seemed to reflect Miss Marple's own mind, thick, mysterious, and heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. As she walked back to her cottage, her thoughts swirled around Mrs. Treadwell's confession. Edith Darby had found something hidden in the shadows of the Darby family's past. Something so dangerous it had cost her life, and now it seemed that the same truth had caught up with Gregory Abbott. But why had he been targeted, and how did Samuel Preston's death fit into this tangled web? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Miss Marple knew the answers would not come easily. Her mind was sharp, but the danger of uncovering the truth was clear. The Darby family had gone to great lengths to keep their secrets, and those secrets were worth protecting. But who among them was willing to kill to keep them hidden? That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire in her cottage, the soft crackling of the wood mingling with the storm outside. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, considering the next step in her investigation. The Darby family had been the center of this mystery from the start, but Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that there was someone else, someone outside of the Darby. Who was pulling the strings. She had seen it before in her long years of solving mysteries, a hidden hand operating behind the scenes, manipulating the course of events. But who could it be? The Darbys were powerful, but there were still too many gaps in their story. Miss Marple had already gathered so much information about them: the land deals, mysterious death of Edith Darby, the involvement of Gregory Abbott, but there was still one person who hadn't yet played their part in the puzzle, one person who could shed light on the true nature of the Darby family's influence. The door to her cottage creaked open, and Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar figure stepping inside. It was Constable Hawkins, his face grim, his expression troubled. Miss Marple. Hawkins greeted her, his voice strained. "I've been to the Darby estate again. Something you need to see." Miss Marple nodded and gestured for him to sit. She could tell from his demeanor that something had shifted, something important had happened. And Hawkins was not one to bring bad news unless it was truly significant. "What's happened, Hawkins?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but curious. Hawkins hesitated before speaking, as if weighing the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "It's about Mrs. Darby. I've been going over the records. The ones you mentioned earlier about the land deals and the connections to the Darby family. I found something I didn't expect, something that doesn't add up." Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What did you find?" Hawkins pulled a small bundle of papers from his coat and placed them on a table in front of Miss Marple. She unfolded them carefully, scanning the contents. The records were old, but there was something immediately striking about them. They were written in a hand Miss Marple recognized. The writing was familiar to familiar. It was Edith Darby's handwriting. "These are Edith's?" Miss Marple asked quietly, her fingers tracing the paper with a sense of unease. Hawkins nodded. "Yes, and these aren't just ordinary records. They're notes Edith made about the Darbys, about the land deals, about the people involved. And what's more, she was tracking something far more dangerous than just financial transactions. She was tracking the illegal activities, the ones that the Darbys went to great lengths to cover up. And she was planning to expose them." Miss Marple's heart quickened. It all made sense now. Edith Darby hadn't just been a casual observer of the Darby family's business dealings. She had been actively involved in uncovering their darkest secrets. But what had she found, and who had she been planning to expose? "I knew Edith had been digging," Miss Marple said softly, more to herself than to Hawkins. "But I had no idea it was this serious. She was onto something that could have brought everything crashing down the Darby's empire, their wealth, their influence. But it's not just about the land deals, is it, Hawkins? This goes deeper." Hawkins nodded, his face pale. "It does. These notes mention more than just illegal land deals. There are references to people who have been involved in, well, let's just say dealings that were far from legal. Edith had started to uncover connections to blackmail, money laundering, and even murder. She had evidence, Miss Marple evidence, that could have destroyed the Darbys." Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed this new information. Everything was starting to fall into place. Edith Darby had been to Kisi, had found the truth, but it had cost her life. And now, someone else had to protect the family's secrets at all costs. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more it became clear. The Darbys were not acting alone. There were others who had been just as invested in keeping the truth buried. "Do you have any idea who killed Edith, Hawkins?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. Hawkins hesitated. "I'm not sure yet, but I'm beginning to think it's someone inside the family. It could be one of the Darbys, but I have a feeling it's someone else, someone who has more to lose than they're willing to admit." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Someone close to the Darbys, someone who knows their deepest secrets, someone who would do anything to protect them." Hawkins nodded slowly. That's what I'm thinking, okay? And I believe they're still out there, Miss Marple. They've been hiding in the shadows this whole time. And now they're starting to realize that someone like U.S. getting too close. Miss Marple stood up, her expression resolute. Then it's time to bring them into the light. We can't wait any longer. The truth is out there, Hawkins, and we're going to find it. The following days passed in a blur of activity as Miss Marple continued to unravel the threads of the Darby family's secrets. She had spoken with more villagers, each conversation adding new layers to the mystery, but also uncovering more questions. Every answer she uncovered seemed to lead to yet another twist, and the more she learned, the more it became clear that Samuel Preston's investigation had been just the tip of the iceberg. Miss Marple's next move was clear. She had to confront Mrs. Darby once again. There were too many unanswered questions now, and the longer the Darby matriarch remained silent, the more Miss Marple realized that the truth could not be hidden any longer. The pieces were all laid out before her. She could feel the weight of them pressing down. She had learned too much about the land deals, the family secrets, the people involved, and now it was time for the final confrontation. As Miss Marple prepared to visit the Darby estate again, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. The mystery was coming to an end, and the time for secrecy was almost over. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon was almost upon them. The truth was ready to break free, and Miss Marple would be there to make sure it was revealed. It was revealed. And so, with steady resolve, Miss Marple walked toward the estate, knowing that the final chapter of the mystery was about to unfold before her eyes. The truth was within her reach, and this time, nothing would stand in her way. The air was thick, with the promise of rain as Miss Marple made her way back to the Darby estate. She had learned much in the past few days, far more than she had expected when she first began her investigation. The tangled web of secrets, lies, and half-truths had grown far more complex than she could have imagined. The Darby family, it seemed, was not just a powerful local family, but a symbol of something much larger, a dynasty built on power, corruption, and control. And now, someone had been murdered to protect that empire. As Miss Marple approached the grand estate, the looming structure seemed darker than before. The once pristine facade, now almost menacing. The secrets hidden behind those walls had grown heavier with each passing day, and Miss Marple knew that it was only a matter of time before they all came tumbling down. The heavy oak door opened as Miss Marple approached, and Mr. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his expression as unreadable as ever. But Miss Marple could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the faint unease in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but strained. "Mrs. Darby is expecting you." Miss Marple nodded and followed Mr. Hargrove through the large, dimly lit hallway. The house was as grand as ever, but there was an oppressive air to it now, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Mrs. Darby, once the picture of composure, now seemed like a woman on the edge, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of TI's, her presence even before she entered the drawing room. Mrs. Darby was seated by the fire, her hands resting delicately in her lap, her eyes distant and cold. When she saw Miss Marple enter, her lips curved into a thin smile, but there was no warmth behind it. The silence between them was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice smooth, but Miss Marple could detect the underlying tension. "I trust you have made progress in your investigation." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes steady as she met Mrs. Darby's gaze. "I have indeed, Mrs. Darby," she said, her voice calm. "And I must admit, I have learned much more than I had anticipated." Mrs. Darby's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm glad to hear that. I trust everything is above board." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze never wavering. I believe it is, but I have a few more questions. See, I've been speaking to various people in the village, and I've come across some rather interesting information. Mrs. Darby's hand twitched ever so slightly, but she didn't react outwardly. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple, she replied, her voice soft but controlled. What sort of information? Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone measured. I've come across the name Edith Darby. I believe she was once part of your family. The mention of Edith's name seemed to strike a nerve. Mrs. Darby's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple caught the fleeting flicker of discomfort in her eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual composure. Edith Darby was a distant relative, Mrs. Darby said, her voice cool. She was never truly part of the family, and her death was a long time ago. I don't see how this is relevant to your investigation. Miss Marple didn't break eye contact, but it is relevant, Mrs. Darby. You see, I've learned that Edith's death was not as simple as you would have us believe. It was not an accident, and I believe it is tied to the events we are now investigating. Mrs. Darby's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something dark behind her eyes. I've told you all I know, Miss Marple, she said, her voice low. Edith's death was a tragic accident, nothing more. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. She had expected this resistance, but it didn't deter her. She had come too far to back down now. There was a truth buried here, and Mrs. Darby was the key to unlocking it. You're lying, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Edith Darby's death was not an accident, and it's not just her death that matters, it's what she uncovered before she died. What she found was worth killing for. Mrs. Darby's hand clenched into a fist in her lap, but her voice remained steady. I don't know what you're insinuating, Miss Marple, but I assure you, my family has done nothing wrong. We have nothing to hide. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were firm. Then why all the secrecy? Why go to such lengths to erase Edith from your family's history? Why kill Gregory Abbott to protect the Darby name? Mrs. Darby's breath caught, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw genuine emotion flicker across her face, a mix of fear and something darker. Something Miss Marple couldn't quite name. You don't understand, Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby whispered. You don't understand what we've had to do, what we've had to protect. The Darby name is all we have left, and we've done what we had to keep it intact. Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice quiet but insistent. What have you had to protect, Mrs. Darby? What dark secret are you trying to keep hidden? For a long moment, Mrs. Darby didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on Miss Marple, and in them, Miss Marple saw the flicker of something more than just fear. She saw guilt, a deep, gnawing guilt. Finally, Mrs. Darby spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The land deal, the one that Gregory Abbott was involved in. It wasn't just about land, Miss Marple. It was about power, real power, and the people behind. They would do anything to keep it secret. We did what we had to do to protect ourselves, to protect our family. Miss Marple stood silently for a moment, processing the information. The land deal had been more than just a transaction. It had been a means to an end, a way to secure power and influence. And Edith Darby had uncovered the truth. She had found something so dangerous that the Darby family and those behind them had been willing to kill to protect it. And what is this secret? Miss Marple asked quietly. What is it that you're so afraid of? Mrs. Darby looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and resolve. I can't tell you, Miss Marple. I can't risk it. There are too many people involved. It's too many powerful people. If the truth comes out, It will destroy everything. And not just the Darby family, everyone. Miss Marple's heart sank as she realized the depth of the conspiracy. This was no ordinary family secret. It was something far more dangerous, something that reached beyond the village, beyond the Darbys. It was a web of corruption and power that had ensnared more people than she had realized, and now it was threatening to unravel. "I understand your fear, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said softly, "but the truth always finds a way to come to light. And when it does, you won't be able to hide behind the walls of your family any longer." The room fell silent, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mrs. Darby's face remained pale, her expression unreadable, but Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. The truth was closer than ever. Killer, the person who had orchestrated Gregory Abbott's death, was out there. Miss Marple was determined to find them. With one final glance at Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple turned and left the drawing room. The storm clouds outside seeming to mirror the storm of truth that was about to break over St. Mary Mead. The walls were beginning to crumble, and the killer was running out of time. Chapter 5. The heavy rain had begun in earnest by the time Miss Marple left the Darby estate, her mind swirling with the implications of her conversation with Mrs. Darby. The woman's confession had brought her closer to the truth, closer to the dark heart of the mystery, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Had Edith Darby been silenced? Why had Gregory Abbott been killed? And what was the true nature of the Darby family's secrets? Miss Marple had come to a troubling conclusion. The Darbys were not acting alone. Their power, their wealth, and their hidden dealings were tied to something much larger. A vast network of corruption had been hidden in the shadows for decades, and now it seemed it was beginning to unravel. But Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was closer than she realized, and that the final piece of the puzzle lay within the village itself. As the storm raged on outside, Miss Marple made her way to the village square, the wet cobblestones glistening in the dim light. The usual quiet of the village had been replaced with an eerie stillness, the weight of the unknown pressing down on every corner of St. Mary Mead. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass and for the truth to finally emerge. Her destination was the pub, a place where the village's gossip flowed as freely as the ale. It was here that Miss Marple had overheard many of the whispers that had guided her investigation, and it was here, she suspected, that she might find the final pieces of the puzzle as she entered the pub. The warm glow of the fire and the murmurs of conversation filled the air. The villagers seemed unfazed by the storm, their voices rising and falling in the usual ebb and flow of village life. But Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and she quickly scanned the room for anyone who might know something useful. She spotted Mrs. Treadwell in the corner, sipping her drink in silence. The woman was always quiet, but Miss Marple had learned that silence often held the most important truths. She made her way over to the table, her footsteps light but purposeful. Mrs. Treadwell looked up as Miss Marple approached, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a smile, though it was strained and uncertain. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Treadwell said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you here." Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, her expression calm but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, Mrs. Treadwell. There's something you're not telling me, something that ties everything together. I need your help to understand it." Mrs. Treadwell shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers tapping nervously on her glass. "I've told you everything I know, Miss Marple. I don't have any more to say. You've already heard the truth." "The truth," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft but insistent. "You've told me part of the truth, but not all of it. There's more here, more that you're afraid to admit, and I need to know what it is." Mrs. Treadwell's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape, but the pub was quiet now, too quiet. The others had fallen silent, aware of the tension between the two women. Miss Marple could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her, but she didn't flinch. She had seen this kind of fear before. It was the kind of fear that came when people realized they could no longer hide from the truth. "Miss Marple, please," Mrs. Treadwell said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand what you're asking. The Darbys aren't just a family. They're a force in this village. Okay, if you go after them, you'll destroy everything, right?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Treadwell's face. "I don't want to destroy anything, Mrs. Treadwell. I just want to understand why Samuel Preston had to die, right? Why Gregory Abbott had to die, and why your family, your husband, was involved." Mrs. Treadwell's face twisted with pain, her hands trembling. "It was never supposed to go this far," she whispered. "We thought we could control it, that we could keep it all quiet. But once Edith started asking questions, once she uncovered things she wasn't supposed to know, ... Miss Marple's heart tightened as she listened. "What did Edith find, Mrs. Treadwell?" Mrs. Treadwell's eyes welled with tears. "She found a connection between the Darbys and the people who had been hiding in the shadows. The people who controlled the land deals, the money, the power. People who were willing to do anything to protect their interest. Edith knew too much, and when she threatened to expose them, my husband, he did what he thought was necessary." Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced the information together. Edith Darby had uncovered a secret so powerful that it had cost her life, and now Mrs. Treadwell was admitting that her husband had played a part in silencing her. But there was still something missing. Who were these people? We had the power to control the Darby family, to manipulate the land deals and business transactions. Who were these people? Mrs. Treadwell, Miss Marple, pressed, who was behind the land deals, killed Gregory Abbott. Mrs. Treadwell shook her head, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I don't know their names, but they were powerful people who had the resources to make anyone disappear. They controlled the money, the deals, and the land. They didn't want anyone interfering with their plans, okay? And when Samuel Preston started asking questions, they knew they had to stop him. The Darbys weren't the only ones who were involved. My husband, ... he was just the middleman. He did what they told him to do." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind spinning with the new information. She had suspected as much, that there were forces beyond the Darbys pulling the strings, but now she had confirmation. The Darby family was just one piece of the puzzle. There were other players involved, and these players were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "I need to know who these people are," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "If we don't expose them, more lives will be lost." Mrs. Treadwell's eyes filled with despair. "I can't tell you, Miss Marple. Can't. My husband, ... he's too far in. If I tell you, we'll all be ruined." Miss Marple stood up, her expression resolute. "Then I will find them myself. And when I do, the truth will come out, no matter the cost." She turned and made her way toward the door, but Mrs. Treadwell's voice stopped her. "Please," Mrs. Treadwell called, her voice pleading. "Don't go after them. They'll destroy you, too. They won't stop until you're silenced." Miss Marple turned back to face her, her gaze steady. "If I don't stop them, Mrs. Treadwell, no one will. The truth has to come out, for everyone's sake." As Miss Marple left the pub, she could feel the weight of the storm gathering within her. The pieces were falling into place, but the final truth was still elusive. She was closer than ever, but there was one more question she needed to answer. Who, exactly, were these people who had so much power, so much control over the Darbys, and why had they been willing to kill for it? The storm was closing in, but Miss Marple would not rest until the truth was revealed. And when it was, nothing would remain hidden any longer. Miss Marple spent the next several days deep in thought. piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that had become her life for the past few weeks. The pieces were almost there. She could feel it. Every conversation, every clue, every detail she had collected was slowly coming together, though the final link still remained elusive. The Darby family's hidden empire, the dark underbelly of St. Mary Mead, and the powerful figures pulling the strings behind the scenes, they were all part of something much bigger. Something Miss Marple had not fully understood until now. As the storm outside subsided, the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable revelation. Miss Marple had done what she could. She had spoken to those who knew the Darby family. She had reviewed the church records, and she had uncovered Edith Darby's tragic end. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized that Edith's death wasn't the only one that needed to be explained. No, it was the beginning of something much darker, something that stretched far beyond the walls of the Darby estate. On the morning of her next visit to the Darby estate, Miss Marple's mind was focused on the final question she needed to answer. Who was the true mastermind behind the murders? Mrs. Treadwell had confirmed much, but there was still a deep suspicion lingering in the air's sense that someone far more powerful than the Darbys had been involved. Someone whose reach extended beyond the village, whose interests were too great to be ignored. The drive to the estate was quiet. The only sound, the soft patter of raindrops falling against the carriage windows. As Miss Marple approached the Darby home, she noticed that the house looked even more imposing than it had the last time she had been here. The windows were tightly shut. The curtains, drawn everything about the place, screamed secrecy. As she could feel it through the air of unease that had settled over the estate. The storm had passed, but the atmosphere felt charged, as if a reckoning was drawing near. When she arrived at the front door, Mr. Hargrove was waiting for her, his face as impassive as ever. But Miss Marple could see the faint lines of tension around his mouth, and she knew that something had changed. Whatever was happening in the Darby household, it was no longer just a family matter, it was something much larger. Miss Marple. Mr. Hargrove greeted her, his voice low, almost as if he was speaking in code. Mrs. Darby is expecting you. Miss Marple nodded and followed him through the grand hall. The house was still as silent as ever, but this time it felt more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were hiding something that had been buried for far too long. She couldn't shake the feeling, an eerie stillness, the weight of the unknown pressing down on every corner of St. Mary Mead. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass and for the truth to finally emerge. Her destination was the pub, a place where the village's gossip flowed as freely as the ale. It was here that Miss Marple had overheard many of the whispers that had guided her investigation, and it was here, she suspected, that she might find the final pieces of the puzzle as she entered the pub. The warm glow of the fire and the murmurs of conversation filled the air. The villagers seemed unfazed by the storm, their voices rising and falling in the usual ebb and flow of village life. But Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and she quickly scanned the room for anyone who might know something useful. She spotted Mrs. Treadwell in the corner, sipping her drink in silence. The woman was always quiet, but Miss Marple had learned that silence often held the most important truths. She made her way over to the table, her footsteps light but purposeful. Mrs. Treadwell looked up as Miss Marple approached, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a smile, though it was strained and uncertain. Miss Marple, Mrs. Treadwell said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't expect to see you here. Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, her expression calm but firm. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, Mrs. Treadwell. There's something you're not telling me, something that ties everything together. I need your help to understand it. Mrs. Treadwell shifted uncomfortably. In her chair, her fingers tapping nervously on her glass. I told you everything I know, Miss Marple. I don't have any more to say. You've already heard the truth. The truth, Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft but insistent. You've told me part of the truth, but not all of it. There's more here, more that you're afraid to admit, and I need to know what it is. Mrs. Treadwell's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape, but the pub was quiet, now too quiet. The others had fallen silent, aware of the tension between the two women. Miss Marple could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her, but she didn't flinch. She had seen this kind of fear before. It was the kind of fear that came when people realized they could no longer hide from the truth. Miss Marple, please, Mrs. Treadwell said, her voice shaking. You don't understand what you're asking. The Darbys aren't just a family, they're a force in this village. If you go after them, you'll destroy everything. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Treadwell's face. I don't want to destroy anything, Mrs. Treadwell. I just want to understand why Samuel Preston had to die, why Gregory Abbott had to die, and why your family, your husband, was involved. Mrs. Treadwell's face twisted with pain, her hands trembling. It was never supposed to go this far, she whispered. We thought we could control it, that we could keep it all quiet. But once Edith started asking questions, once she uncovered things she wasn't supposed to know, ... Miss Marple's heart tightened as she listened. What did Edith find? Mrs. Treadwell. Mrs. Treadwell's eyes welled with tears. She found the connection between the Darbys and the people who had been hiding in the shadows. The people who controlled the land deals, the money, the power, okay? People who were willing to do anything to protect their interests, okay? Edith knew too much, and when she threatened to expose them, my husband, he did what he thought was necessary. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced the information together. Edith Darby had uncovered a secret so powerful that it had cost her life, okay? And now, Mrs. Treadwell was admitting that her husband had played a part in silencing her. There was still something missing. Who were these people who had the power to control the Darby family, to manipulate the land deals and business transactions? Who were these people? Mrs. Treadwell, Miss Marple, pressed, who was behind the land deals? Who killed Gregory Abbott? Mrs. Treadwell shook her head, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I don't know their names, but they were powerful people who had the resources to make anyone disappear. They controlled the money, the deals, and the land. They didn't want anyone interfering with their plans. And when Samuel Preston started asking questions, they knew they had to stop him. The Darbys weren't the only ones who were involved. My husband, ... He was just the middleman. He did what they told him to do. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind spinning with the new information. She had suspected as much, that there were forces beyond the Darbys pulling the strings, but now she had confirmation. The Darby family was just one piece of the puzzle. There were other players involved, and these players were willing to kill to protect their secrets. I need to know who these people are, Miss Marple said, her voice firm. If we don't expose them, more lives will be lost. Mrs. Treadwell's eyes filled with despair. I can't tell you, Miss Marple, can't. My husband, ... He's too far in. If I tell you, we'll all be ruined. Miss Marple stood up, her expression resolute. Then I will find them myself, okay? And when I do, the truth will come out, no matter the cost. She turned and made her way toward the door, but Mrs. Treadwell's voice stopped her. Please, Mrs. Treadwell called, her voice pleading. Don't go after them. They'll destroy you, too. They won't stop until you're silenced. Miss Marple turned back to face her, her gaze steady. If I don't stop them, Mrs. Treadwell, no one will. The truth has to come out. For everyone's sake. As Miss Marple left the pub, she could feel the weight of the storm gathering within her. The pieces were falling into place, but the final truth was still elusive. She was closer than ever, but there was one more question she needed to answer. Who, exactly, were these people who had so much power, so much control over the Darbys, and why had they been willing to kill for it? The storm was closing in, but Miss Marple would not rest until the truth was revealed. And when it was, nothing would remain hidden any longer. Miss Marple spent the next several days deep in thought, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that had become her life for the past few weeks. The pieces were almost there. She could feel it. Every conversation, every clue, every detail she had collected was slowly coming together, though the final link still remained elusive. The Darby family's hidden empire, the dark underbelly of St. Mary Mead, and the powerful figures pulling the strings behind the scenes. They were all part of something much bigger, something Miss Marple had not fully understood until now. As the storm outside subsided, the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable revelation. Miss Marple had done what she could. She had spoken to those who knew the Darby family. She had reviewed the church records, and she had uncovered Edith Darby's tragic end. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized that Edith's death wasn't the only one that needed to be explained. No, it was the beginning of something much darker, something that stretched far beyond the walls of the Darby estate. On the morning of her next visit to the Darby estate, Miss Marple's mind was focused on the final question she needed to answer. Who was the true mastermind behind the murders? Mrs. Treadwell had confirmed much, but there was still a deep suspicion lingering in the air, a sense that someone far more powerful than the Darbys had been involved. Someone whose reach extended beyond the village, whose interests were too great to be ignored. The drive to the estate was quiet. The only sound, the soft patter of raindrops falling against the carriage windows. As Miss Marple approached the Darby home, she noticed that the house looked even more imposing than it had the last time she had been here. The windows were tightly shut. The curtains, drawn everything about the place, screamed secrecy. She could feel it, too, the air of unease that had settled over the estate. The storm had passed, but the atmosphere felt charged, as if a reckoning was drawing near. When she arrived at the front door, Mr. Hargrove was waiting for her, his face as impassive as ever, but Miss Marple could see the faint lines of tension around his mouth, and she knew that something had changed. Whatever was happening in the Darby household, it was no longer just a family matter. It was something much larger. Miss Marple, Mr. Hargrove greeted her, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking in code. Mrs. Darby is expecting you. Miss Marple nodded and followed him through the grand hall. The house was still as silent as ever, but this time it felt more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were hiding something that had been buried for far too long. She couldn't shake the feeling. Had been part of the scheme, but they had also been manipulated, controlled by a force that was greater than themselves. And that force was now starting to show its true nature. Miss Marple knew that she had to speak with Mr. Treadwell again. Man had been too quiet during their first meeting, and Miss Marple suspected that he knew more than he had let on. But there was something else, something about his demeanor during their conversation that suggested he was not just a bystander. He was involved in something much darker. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the Treadwell cottage once again, her footsteps slow but determined. The sky was overcast, and the village was still wrapped in the calm after the storm. The Treadwell home, like most of the houses in St. Mary Mead, looked quaint and serene, but Miss Marple knew better. She could feel the tension in the air as she approached the door, her senses alert to the slightest shift in the atmosphere. When Mr. Treadwell answered the door, his face tightened slightly as he saw Miss Marple standing on the doorstep. There was no warmth in his greeting, only a guarded wariness that Miss Marple had come to recognize in those who had something to hide. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a little too calm. "I wasn't expecting you again so soon." "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Treadwell," Miss Marple said with her characteristic softness, "but I need to speak with you again. There are still things that I don't fully understand, and I believe you can help me fill in the gaps." Expression flickered with uncertainty before he stepped aside to allow her in. The cottage was much like the others in the village, neat, cozy, and filled with the quiet warmth of a home. But Miss Marple could sense the tension that lay beneath the surface. The silence between them as they sat in the sitting room was almost palpable, and Miss Marple's mind was already racing, picking apart the smallest of details. "I understand that your family has been involved with the Darbys for quite some time," Miss Marple began, her voice steady and probing. "But I also believe there's more to the story than you've told me, something you're not sharing." Mr. Treadwell stiffened, but Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but insistent. "You see, Mr. Treadwell, I've learned about the land deals, the ones that involve your estate. But there's something else, something that doesn't add up. I believe you know more about Gregory Abbott's murder than you've let on. You were involved in the same dealings that led to Edith Darby's death, and now you're connected to the killing of Gregory Abbott as well." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of truth. Mr. Treadwell's eyes widened, and for a moment Miss Marple could see the mask of composure crack, but just as quickly it was gone, replaced by a cold, unreadable expression. "I told you before," Mr. Treadwell said, his voice low and controlled, "that I had no part in these things. My family has never been involved in anything criminal." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "I believe you believe that, Mr. Treadwell, but I've learned that the truth is often more complicated than we first think. I believe your wife knows more than she's told me, and I believe you do as well." Mr. Treadwell shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening around the edge of his cup. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. "Look, Miss Marple," Mr. Treadwell finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what you're asking, but Darby's, They, they've been controlling things here for years. They've made deals, made promises, and made threats. People who go against them, people who try to uncover the truth, end up dead." Miss Marple's heart raced as she listened to Mr. Treadwell's confession. He was right. She had uncovered the truth. Hey, it was starting to unravel everything the Darby family had worked so hard to keep hidden. The land, the deals, the murders, all of it was tied together by a single thread. And now Miss Marple knew the thread was about to snap. She leaned forward, her voice calm but full of quiet determination. "Then it's time to bring the truth to light, Mr. Treadwell. Time for the world to see what the Darbys have been hiding." Mr. Treadwell looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. He knew, just as Miss Marple did, that the time for silence was over. The final truth was at hand. The puzzle was nearly complete, and soon the killer would be unmasked. The days that followed Miss Marple's conversation with Mr. Treadwell were filled with an uneasy quiet that seemed to have settled over St. Mary Mead. The storm that had passed earlier in the week seemed to have been a reflection of the storm brewing within the village itself. Each day, Miss Marple's mind raced with the new information she had uncovered, each clue leading her closer to the final truth. But despite the progress, one thing still gnawed at her. Time was running out. The Darby family, with their long-held secrets and connections, had been her primary focus, but as her investigation had unfolded, it became clear that they were not the only ones involved in the dark dealings. The Treadwells, with their quiet involvement in the land deals, had only been the tip of the iceberg. Mrs. Treadwell's confession had confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected, that there were powerful forces at play, forces that had been carefully concealed for years. but the true mastermind remained hidden in the shadows. Now, as Miss Marple sat in her small study, reviewing her notes and piecing together the final threads of the mystery, she knew that she was close to unraveling the entire story. The pieces of the puzzle were almost in place, but she still needed one final confession to tie it all together. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily as Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the window. The morning had dawned clear, the sun breaking through the lingering clouds. There was a crispness to the air that suggested chan's inevitable shift that Miss Marple could feel deep in her bones. The truth was coming, and with it, the end of the mystery that had held the village in its grip for so long. Miss Marple stood, her thoughts clear and focused. It was time to speak with Mrs. Darby again. The woman had been evasive, but Miss Marple could sense that she knew more than she had let on. Mrs. Darby had been hiding behind layers of deceit, but now the final confrontation was upon them. When Miss Marple arrived at the Darby estate, the atmosphere felt different. The grand house, which had always seemed a place of power and control, now appeared less imposing, its windows dark and closed off. There was a heaviness in the air, a palpable sense of tension that seemed to hang over the estate like a thick fog. Miss Marple could feel the weight of the family's secrets pressing down on her as she made her way up the front steps. Mr. Hargrove, as always, greeted her at the door, but this time his face betrayed something different. There was no polite formality in his expression, only the faintest trace of fear, barely perceptible, but enough to make Miss Marple pause. "Miss Marple," he said, quietly, almost reluctantly, "Mrs. Darby is expecting you." Miss Marple nodded and followed him inside, her steps light but firm. She had been here many times before, but today felt different. Today, she was closing in on the truth, and she could feel the final pieces of the puzzle snapping into place as they walked down the hallway. Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the silence that hung in the air. The usual bustle of servants moving about was absent, and the house felt eerily still. There was no warmth in the atmosphere, no sense of home, just a cold, oppressive quiet that mirrored the emotions swirling within the family. When they reached the drawing room, Miss Marple was not surprised to see Mrs. Darby sitting by the fire, her posture as composed as ever. But there was something different in her eyes today. The confident, composed woman Miss Marple had encountered before was now replaced by someone who seemed to be on the verge of breaking. Mrs. Darby's face was drawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she were holding onto something precious, something fragile. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice quieter than usual, "I didn't expect you so soon. I'm afraid I've come to ask some more questions." "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but steady, "I've uncovered a great deal, but there is still one thing that eludes me, the truth behind Gregory Abbott's death and why it happened." Mrs. Darby's lips pressed together, her expression hardening slightly. "You know as much as I can tell you, Miss Marple. The truth is that Gregory Abbott was killed, and I regret that deeply. But there is nothing more to say." Miss Marple observed her carefully, noting the rigidity in Mrs. Darby's posture. She could see the walls that had been built around Hertha, walls that had been crumbling, bit by bit, as Miss Marple's investigation had pressed on. The woman was trying to hide her fear, but it was evident in the way she clenched her hands, the way her eyes flickered nervously. Miss Marple could feel the tension in the room, and she knew that the time for subtlety had passed. It was time to confront the truth directly. "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said quietly, "I know you're hiding something. The land deals, the connections, two powerful people, the death of Edith Darby, all of it points to something much larger than we've been led to believe. But you're not alone in this. There are others, people who are just as invested in keeping the truth buried." Mrs. Darby's face tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might refuse to speak any further. But then, with a deep sigh, Mrs. Darby's shoulders slumped slightly, and she looked up at Miss Marple with a resigned expression. "You're right," she said softly. "I have tried to protect my family, to protect our legacy, but the truth is it's not just about us. There are others involved, powerful people who have been behind the Darby family's rise to prominence. And when Edith found out what we were really doing, she became a threat. She was going to expose everything." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Darby's face. Who were these people, Mrs. Darby? Who were the ones pulling the strings? Mrs. Darby hesitated for a long moment, her lips trembling slightly as she struggled to find the words. "It's not just about the Darbys," she whispered. "It's about the entire village. The land deals were only part of it. There were people in power, people who controlled everything. They had the money, the influence, and the ability to do anything to keep their secrets safe. And when Edith started asking questions, they knew they had to act. They had to silence her before she could ruin everything." The silence in the room was suffocating. Miss Marple's mind raced as she absorbed the weight of Mrs. Darby's words. The Darby family was not just a victim in this story. They were complicit, tangled in a web of deceit and murder. The powerful people behind the scenes had used the Darbys as pawns in their game, and now Miss Marple understood the full extent of the danger they faced. "And Gregory Abbott?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low. Mrs. Darby's eyes darkened. He had become involved with the wrong people. He had seen things, learned things that he wasn't supposed to know. He was a loose end, and loose ends can never be allowed to remain. Abbott had to die just like Edith. Miss Marple's breath caught as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The land deals, the murders, the lies, it was all part of a much larger conspiracy, one that had been hidden in plain sight. The truth had been staring her in the face all along. "I understand now," Miss Marple said softly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "The killer is someone who has been hiding in the shadows, someone who has the power to make people disappear. And soon the truth will come out. The walls are closing in, Mrs. Darby, and there's no escape." Miss Marple turned to leave. Mrs. Darby's voice stopped her. "Please, Miss Marple," she said, her voice pleading. "You don't understand. If you go any further, you'll be putting yourself in danger. There are forces at work here that no one can control." Miss Marple paused, her hand on the door. She looked back at Mrs. Darby, her gaze steady and unwavering. "The truth always comes to light, Mrs. Darby. No matter how long it takes, no matter how much it costs, and when it does, the killer will be revealed." The final thread was about to snap. The killer's identity was within reach, and the truth was coming to the surface, piece by piece. Miss Marple had no intention of stopping until the final confession was made. The dark secrets of St. Mary Mead were brought into the light once and for all. The rain had returned, though it was softer now, a gentle drizzle that seemed to wash over St. Mary Mead like a veil of uncertainty. Miss Marple stood by the window of her cottage, her thoughts swirling as she gazed out at the wet village streets. The quiet peace of the village felt almost deceptive now, as if it were trying to hide the storm that raged beneath its surface. The truth, Miss Marple knew, had a way of working its way to the surface, even in the most still and calm places. She had learned so much over the past few weeks, more than she had ever expected. A Darby family, with all their wealth and influence, had been nothing more than pawns in a much larger game. They had hidden their secrets for decades, covering up murder, betrayal, and lies. But as Miss Marple had peeled back the layers, she had discovered that the Darbys were not the only ones involved. There were others, people who had been working behind the scenes, manipulating events for their own gain. And now, It seemed their efforts to keep the truth buried were starting to unravel. The final confrontation was approaching. She could feel it in her bones. The killer, whoever they were, was running out of time. The lies that had been carefully constructed for so many years were beginning to crack. But there was one more question that Miss Marple needed answered. Who had the most to gain from all of this? Who had been the true mastermind behind the deaths of Gregory Abbott, Edith Darby, and Samuel Preston? As Miss Marple turned away from the window, her gaze fell on the stack of papers on her desk. She had reviewed the evidence 100 times, but each time she returned to it, she found something new, something she had missed before. She had spoken with everyone she needed to speak to, examined every piece of the puzzle, but the final piece remained elusive. The killer's identity was still hidden behind a wall of lies. And Miss Marple knew she couldn't bring the truth to light without first breaking down that wall. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock at the door. Miss Marple stood up, her heart quickening as she walked over to answer it. She opened the door to find Mr. Hargrove standing on the doorstep, his expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "there's something you need to see." Without waiting for a response, he stepped inside, his demeanor tense. Miss Marple gestured for him to sit, her curiosity piqued. She had not expected to see him again so soon, but something in his eyes told her that whatever he had to show her would be important. "I've been going over some things," Mr. Hargrove began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I believe I've found something you should know. Something that could change everything." Miss Marple remained silent, her gaze fixed on him. She had learned over the years that Mr. Hargrove was not a man who spoke without reason. Whatever he had to say was likely significant, and Miss Marple was ready to hear it. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. "There's a ledger," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A ledger that contains records of transactions, payments, and deals that go back decades. It's been hidden in the estate's library, tucked away in a locked drawer. I only found it recently, and when I went through it, I realized something. It's more to the Darby family's wealth than anyone knows, more than anyone can even begin to imagine." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected that the Darbys were involved in more than just land deals, but the idea that there was an entire hidden history one that could unravel. Everything was both thrilling and terrifying. "What kind of transactions?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but filled with urgency. Mr. Hargrove swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of the chair. "The ledger details financial dealings, but it's not just money. It's power, it's influence. There are names in that ledger, names that I'm certain have never been mentioned in connection with the Darby family before. Powerful names, people who have been pulling the strings for years." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, absorbing the weight of his words. "Who are these people, Mr. Hargrove?" He hesitated, clearly struggling with whether or not to reveal the truth, but after a moment, he seemed to make up his mind. "I think you already know some of them. The Darbys didn't just make money through land deals. They made money through illegal transactions, through blackmail and bribery. And the people they were working with, they have connections far beyond this village. They've been hiding in plain sight, Miss Marple. They're the ones who killed Gregory Abbott, and they're the ones who made sure Edith Darby's death was buried." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The pieces were falling into place faster now, and Miss Marple could feel the truth just out of reach. But there was something Mr. Hargrove had said that struck her as odd. "Okay, who are these people, Mr. Hargrove?" "Okay," she asked again, her voice firm. Mr. Hargrove's eyes darted toward the door, as if making sure no one was listening. Then, with a resigned sigh, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The people behind. The Darbys, the ones who have been controlling everything here, the same people who were involved in the land deals all those years ago. Okay? They're the ones who got Edith killed, and they're the ones who have been manipulating the Darbys ever since. The family has been a pawn in their game for decades. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The game was bigger than she had thought, far bigger than anyone could have imagined. These were not just criminals trying to make money. They were part of a much larger conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond St. Mary Mead. I know who they are, Miss Marple said softly, more to herself than to Mr. Hargrove. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The people behind the Darbys were not just wealthy landowners or shady business partners. They were part of a network, a powerful faction that had been operating in the shadows for years, controlling everything from politics to business to law enforcement. The pieces had always been there, waiting to be connected. What happens now? Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but filled with resolve. Mr. Hargrove looked at her, his face grim. The truth will come out, Miss Marple, but we have to be careful. These people are powerful, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets. You've already made enemies in this village, but if you continue down this path, they won't stop until they've silenced you, too. Miss Marple's eyes hardened, and she stood, her decision made. Let them try, Mr. Hargrove. The truth is stronger than any power they can wield. With that, she turned and left the room, her mind set on the final steps of her investigation. The killer's identity was now clear, and Miss Marple knew that the end was near. The walls of secrecy were about to crumble, and when they did, the entire village would be forced to confront the truth. As Miss Marple stepped into the street, she felt a sense of purpose wash over her. The storm had passed, and with it, the dark clouds that had hung over St. Mary Mead for so long. The truth would come to light, no matter the cost. The end was near, and Miss Marple would be there to see it through to the very end. Chapter 7. The morning of the confrontation with the killer was cold. The sky still gray with the remnants of the storm that had passed through St. Mary Mead. The village, typically quiet and idyllic, now seemed shrouded in an air of unease. It was as if the very land itself held its breath, waiting for the truth to surface, truth that Miss Marple knew would unravel everything. From the deaths of Gregory Abbott and Samuel Preston to the hidden dealings of the Darby family, Miss Marple stood at the window of her cottage, her eyes scanning the streets below, deep in thought. She had come so far, unraveling the Darby family's dark secrets, covering Edith Darby's tragic death, and piecing together the web of lies that had ensnared the village. She knew that the final confrontation was approaching. There was no turning back now. The truth had been buried for too long, and she was the one who had to bring it into the light. The more she reflected on the details, the more she understood the true nature of the conspiracy. Mrs. Darby's confession had been a vital step, but Miss Marple knew there was still more to uncover. The powerful people behind the Darby family, the ones who had orchestrated the murders and covered up the truth, had not yet been fully revealed. These were the same people who had manipulated the land deals, used blackmail, and controlled the village's politics. They had created a network of influence that stretched far beyond St. Mary Mead, and now they were running out of time. Miss Marple knew the final piece of the puzzle lay in the hands of one person, someone who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. But who could it be? Who was the mastermind behind the murders? She had a suspicion, but she needed confirmation. The time to act had come. The door to her cottage creaked open, and Miss Marple turned to see Constable Hawkins standing in the doorway. His expression was grave, his shoulders tense. It was clear that whatever he had to say was important. Miss Marple, Hawkins said, his voice tight, there's been a development. I think we've found the link we've been missing. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly crossed the room to join him. "What have you discovered, Hawkins?" Hawkins looked at her with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "I went through the records again, the ones we found at the Darby estate. There was something I overlooked before. A name that ties everything together. The land deals, the murders, and the power behind it all." Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. "Who is it?" Hawkins hesitated, glancing around the room as though making sure no one else was listening. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "It's Henry Carrington. He's been the one pulling the strings. He's the one who's been behind everything. The Darbys, the land deals, they were all part of his plan." Carrington. The name echoed in Miss Marple's mind. She had heard the name before, but she hadn't realized the true extent of his involvement. Henry Carrington was not just a wealthy businessman in the village. He was the linchpin, the one who had orchestrated the entire operation. He had used the Darbys as pawns, manipulating them to his advantage. He had been the one who had orchestrated Edith Darby's death to silence her, and he had been the one who had ensured that Gregory Abbott and Samuel Preston were eliminated when they got too close to the truth. Miss Marple's mind raced. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still one more thing she needed to know. Why had Carrington done this? What was his ultimate goal? What did he stand to gain from the deaths and the deception? "He's been using the Darby family as a front," Hawkins continued, his voice low. "Carrington's been manipulating them. 4 years, controlling the land deals, using the village's influence to secure his own wealth. But it wasn't just about money, it was about power. And when Edith started digging into his dealings, he had no choice but to eliminate her. Couldn't afford to have her expose him." Miss Marple nodded, absorbing the information. Carrington had used the Darbys as a smokescreen, hiding behind their wealth and influence while he carried out his own agenda. But what was the ultimate goal? What did Carrington stand to gain from all this? Miss Marple could feel that there was more to the story, more that she needed to uncover. "We need to confront him," Miss Marple said, her voice steady with determination. "If he's the one behind all of this, we can't waste any more time. It's time to expose the truth." Hawkins looked hesitant, his brow furrowed. "It won't be easy, Miss Marple. Carrington is powerful, well-connected. He won't go down without a fight." Miss Marple's expression softened, her eyes gleaming with quiet confidence. "I'm not afraid of him, Hawkins. I've faced much worse in my time. We've come this far, and we can't stop now. The truth is within our reach." With that, Miss Marple made her way toward the door. Hawkins followed, still uncertain but knowing that there was no turning back now. They were about to confront the mastermind behind the murders, a person who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The journey to Carrington's estate was tense, the sky darkening as the storm clouds began to gather once more. Miss Marple sat quietly in the carriage, her mind focused on the task at hand. Carrington was the key to everything: the land deals, the murders, the hidden network of corruption that had taken root in the village. And now it was time to bring him into the light. As they arrived at the gates of Carrington's estate, Miss Marple felt a surge of determination. The mansion loomed in front of them, its cold stone facade casting long shadows in the fading light. The estate was as imposing as the man who owned it, a symbol of wealth and power. But Miss Marple knew that even the most powerful structures could be brought down. Carrington was inside. Miss Marple was certain of that. It was time to confront him, to expose his lies and bring an end to the reign of secrecy that had held the village in its grip for so long. She stepped out of the carriage, her posture straight and her gaze unwavering. Hawkins followed her, his face set in a grim expression. They approached the front door, and as Miss Marple raised her hand to knock, she felt a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The tension in the house was palpable. Carrington knew they were coming. They were coming. The door swung open, and there he stood. Henry Carrington, tall and imposing, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. He didn't seem surprised to see Miss Marple. In fact, he seemed almost prepared for this moment. "I've been expecting you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. Miss Marple met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I'm sure you have, Mr. Carrington, but the time for secrets is over. It's time to answer for what you've done." Carrington's smile faltered for just a moment before it returned, cold and calculating. "You think you've uncovered something, don't you? But you've only scratched the surface. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "I know about Edith Darby, about the land deals, about the people you've used to get what you want. And I know that you killed Gregory, Abbott, and Samuel Preston to protect your secrets." Carrington's face hardened, but he didn't speak. Miss Marple took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "It's over, Mr. Carrington," she said softly. "The truth always comes to light, and now it's your turn to face the consequences." For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if a mask had fallen away, Carrington's expression shifted. He took a step back, his posture deflating, and Miss Marple knew that the time had come. The truth was finally within reach. "You think you've won, Miss Marple?" Carrington said, his voice a low growl. "But you haven't even begun to understand what's at stake." Miss Marple stood firm, her voice unwavering. "I understand perfectly. The truth is stronger than any of your lies. It's time for it to be exposed." Miss Marple and Hawkins moved closer. The storm outside seemed to break, and with it, the last vestiges of Carrington's power. The web of lies was crumbling, and the truth would finally come to light. Miss Marple stood still, her gaze unwavering as Henry Carrington's face shifted from confident detachment to something more akin to calculation. As if he were assessing how much longer he could maintain his composure. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, as though the very walls of the mansion were holding their breath. Carrington, a man accustomed to control and power, now found himself facing the one thing he couldn't manipulate: truth. Miss Marple's presence, calm and deliberate, cut through the facade he had so carefully built, revealing the cracks beneath the surface. She had expected this moment, but now that it had arrived, she found herself studying Carrington not as a criminal, but as a man cornered by his own lies. And as always, Miss Marple could sense the fragile human behind the arrogance. "You seem confident, Miss Marple," Carrington said, his tone laced with thinly veiled amusement. "But you must realize, even now, you're too late. What's done is done. You've unearthed some truths, yes, but the wheels are in motion, and nothing you do can stop it now." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. "Oh, I think you're mistaken, Mr. Carrington. You see, it's never too late for the truth. It may take time, it may twist and turn through the shadows, but it always comes to light in the end." Carrington's lips tightened as his gaze hardened. "You don't understand the forces you're meddling with. You've done your bit, Miss Marple, but you're out of your depth. People like me don't go down easily." Miss Marple's eyes were sharp as she studied him, noting the slight tremor in his clenched jaw. For all his bravado, Miss Marple could see through the cracks. He was worried, perhaps for the first time in a long while. There was nothing more dangerous than a man who realized his empire of lies was crumbling. "I think you're mistaken, Mr. Carrington," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "It's not just people like you who get to dictate the course of events. And it's certainly not you who gets to decide who wins or loses. You're not invincible, no matter how powerful you think you are." Hawkins, who had been standing just a few paces behind Miss Marple, shifted slightly, his hand resting on the edge of a chair, as if ready to spring into action if needed. But Miss Marple knew he understood this moment better than anyone. This wasn't about physical confrontation. It was about unraveling the layers of lies, about confronting the mastermind, and showing them that their power was nothing compared to the relentless pursuit of truth. Carrington took a step back, quietly trying to regain some semblance of control. You have no idea what you're up against, okay? The people involved in this, they're beyond anything you can comprehend. Miss Marple's expression softened, her voice growing even quieter. That may be true, but the truth is always simpler than we imagine. It's just a matter of finding the right pieces and fitting them together. Carrington's eyes flicked toward the door, as if calculating his options. He knew, deep down, that he had few choices left. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place far too neatly, and Miss Marple had left no room for denial. She had brought the truth to the doorstep of his carefully constructed world, and now he was forced to face it. You're not the first person to think they could uncover my secrets, Carrington said, his voice now edged with bitterness. There have been others who thought they could take me down. But you'll see, Miss Marple, the system is too strong, the connections too deep. There's no place in this world for people like you. No room for people who dig too deep into things they shouldn't understand. Miss Marple met his gaze with a calmness that seemed to cut through the tension. You're wrong about that, Mr. Carrington. You see, I understand more than you think. Your empire of deceit was built on land, money, and manipulation. But the more you control, the more fragile it becomes. And now, you're the one who's trapped. For a long moment, Carrington stared at her, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple could sense the battle waging within him, the desire to lash out, to protect his secrets, and the dawning realization that it was too late. She had known from the beginning that this confrontation would come to a head sooner or later. She had prepared for this moment, had spent countless hours piecing together the truth. Finally, Carrington broke the silence, his voice hoarse and strained. You think you've won, don't you? You think you've uncovered the final truth? But what will it change? What good is the truth if it can't stop the inevitable? Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence steady and calm, as though she were facing a man who had long ago given up the fight. It changes everything, Mr. Carrington. The truth isn't about winning or losing. It's about exposing what's been hidden. And it's not just about you or your empire, it's about the people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed. It's about the lives of those you thought you could manipulate and control. The truth has a way of righting those wrongs. Harrington's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his words falling heavy in the room. For a fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw the man behind the mask, the one who had orchestrated so many lives, so many deaths from the shadows. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough. The truth had pierced through the armor of power and control he had built around himself. I've spent my whole life building this, Miss Marple, Carrington said, his voice quieter now, almost as if speaking to himself. Everything I've done to protect what's mine. The Darbys, the land, the wealthy, it's all I've ever cared about. And now you come here, telling me it's all meaningless, that everything I've worked for is just a lie. Miss Marple's voice softened, her tone gentle but unwavering. It's never too late to do the right thing, Mr. Carrington. You still have a choice. You can walk away from this, from all the lies, and let the truth come to light. Or you can continue hiding, continue running, but in the end, the truth will always catch up with you. There was a long pause as Carrington stood in the middle of the room, seemingly lost in thought. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of brandy on the table beside him. He didn't drink from it immediately, just stared at it, as if the glass held the weight of everything he had ever done. Then, as though making a decision, he put the glass down with a decisive motion and looked up at Miss Marple. "You're right," he said, his voice hollow. "I've spent my life building this empire, but it's built on lies, and now I'm trapped by them." Miss Marple nodded, the quiet understanding between them filling the space. She had known that it would come to this, that Carrington would finally see the truth for what it was. And now, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. "You're not alone, Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said softly. "There are others involved, others who will need to answer for their part in this. But for now, it's time to make things right." Carrington's face seemed to crumple under the weight of her words, and Miss Marple knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The truth was out, and nothing could stop it now. The lies were shattered, the pieces scattered. The killer's identity was no longer a mystery, but the story was far from over. The repercussions of the truth would be far-reaching, and the village of St. Mary Mead would never be the same. The day after her conversation with Henry Carrington, Miss Marple felt a strange stillness hanging over St. Mary Mead. The storm had passed, leaving the village bathed in the cool light of a calm morning. But the air, though clear, felt thick with the anticipation of something inevitable, something that could no longer be postponed. As Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reflecting on the events that had unfolded, she knew that the moment of reckoning was upon her. Carrington had finally broken his walls of arrogance and self-assurance, crumbling under the weight of his guilt. And now, with the truth in her grasp, Miss Marple felt the responsibility of revealing it all. She had worked tirelessly, piecing together the story of the Darby family's corruption, of Edith Darby's death, and of the conspiracy that had stretched far beyond the village's borders. But the final step, the final confrontations, still awaited. The last few weeks had felt like a lifetime. Miss Marple had uncovered secrets that no one had dared to speak, dug into the deepest corners of St. Mary Mead society, and watched as those secrets slowly unraveled. She had learned more than she had expected, not just about the Darbys, but about the lengths people would go to protect their power, shield their lives from the truth. And yet, despite all the revelations, there was still one thing that haunted her. Carrington had confessed, but the forces behind him, the people who had orchestrated this entire scheme, were still out there. The network of deceit and manipulation was far larger than she had anticipated. And Miss Marple understood that this was not just about the Darbys or even the murders. It was about something far more dangerous, the power to control, to silence those who stood in their way. The knock at the door broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Constable Hawkins standing on the threshold. His face was grim, his posture rigid, and Miss Marple could tell that something had changed. Hawkins had been by her side through much of this investigation, his loyalty and dedication unwavering. But there was something different about him now, something that suggested the truth was no longer just an abstract concept, but a force that was about to change everything. "Miss Marple," Hawkins said, his voice low, "I've just come from the Darby estate. I think you need to see something." Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had expected Carrington to make his move, but she hadn't anticipated it would be so soon. Hawkins's tone suggested that the confrontation they had been leading toward was now imminent, and that they were about to face the final, undeniable truth. Without a word, Miss Marple rose and followed Hawkins out of the cottage, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She had always known that truth, once revealed, could be a double-edged sword. It could heal wounds, but it could also destroy the very foundations of everything people had built. The ride to the Darby estate was silent, save for the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves on the wet cobblestone roads. The village, normally alive with gossip and chatter, seemed eerily quiet, as if it too was waiting for the final act of this long-running drama to unfold. Miss Marple kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her mind racing as she considered the implications of what she was about to uncover. Carrington's confession had been just the beginning. Now, they were heading toward the final confrontation, the moment when everything would come to light. When they arrived at the Darby estate, Miss Marple could feel the tension in the air. The mansion loomed before her, as imposing as ever, but there was an unsettling stillness to it now. The house seemed to be waiting, as if it too knew that the end was near. Mr. Hargrove met them at the door, his face pale and drawn. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a short time since. Miss Marple had last seen him. His usual composed demeanor had given way to an anxiety that was almost palpable. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "Mrs. Darby is waiting for you in the drawing room. She has something to say." Miss Marple nodded and followed Mr. Hargrove into the mansion. The familiar smell of polished wood and leather filled the air, but there was no warmth in the house anymore. It felt cold, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. When they entered the drawing room, Mrs. Darby was standing by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked more fragile than Miss Marple had ever seen her posture hunched, her face pale and drawn. She had always been a woman of great strength, but now the weight of her family's secrets had broken her. She looked as though she was standing on the edge of something, about to fall into the abyss. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice shaking slightly, I have something to tell you. Something that I should have told you from the very beginning." Miss Marple took a step forward, her gaze steady and kind. "Go on, Mrs. Darby. The truth is always the first step toward healing." Mrs. Darby took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice low and hesitant. "You were right, Miss Marple. My family is not what it seems. We've been hiding behind lies for years, and I've been complicit in all of it. But there's something I never told you. Something that's been weighing on my conscience for far too long." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she listened, knowing that this was the moment she had been waiting for. The final confession, the one that would tie everything together. It was never just about the land deals, Mrs. Darby continued, her voice trembling. It was about control, about power. Henry Carrington, the man you've been investigating, he's not just some businessman. He's the one who's been pulling the strings all along. And when Edith Darby discovered his involvement, she was silenced. She knew too much, and she was going to expose him. Miss Marple's eyes widened as the pieces began to click into place. Carrington had been the mastermind all along. He had used the Darbys as pawns in his game, manipulating them for his own gain. And when Edith Darby had threatened to expose him, he had made sure she was eliminated. "But that's not all," Mrs. Darby said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gregory Abbott was involved too. He had gotten too close to the truth, and Carrington couldn't afford to let him live. So he ordered his death as well." The revelation struck Miss Marple like a lightning bolt. Carrington had orchestrated the deaths of both Edith Darby and Gregory Abbott, manipulating the Darby family from the shadows. Why? What was his ultimate goal? Carrington used the Darbys as a cover, Miss Marple said softly, her voice filled with quiet realization. He manipulated you all for his own ends, but there's something more, isn't there? What was his ultimate goal, Mrs. Darby? Mrs. Darby shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, Miss Marple, but I do know that Carrington has been using my family for years. It's been involved in much darker dealings than we ever realized. And now it's too late." Miss Marple's heart sank as she realized the full extent of the conspiracy. Carrington had been using the Darby family for his own power. And now, with the truth finally coming to light, The storm of corruption that had gripped St. Mary Mead for so long was about to break. The truth is finally coming out. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said softly, and there will be consequences, but it's not too late to make things right. Mrs. Darby nodded, her face a mask of sorrow and regret. I know, Miss Marple, and I'm ready to face whatever comes. As Miss Marple turned to leave, she knew that the final chapter of this mystery was almost complete. The truth had come to light, and now the Darby family's darkest secrets would be exposed for all to see. The killer would be unmasked, and the village would finally be free of the lies that had held it captive for so long. The reckoning had come, and nothing would remain hidden any longer.